The morning my daughter-in-law arrived at my house, 4 days after we buried my wife, she wasn't carrying flowers or a casserole. She was carrying a briefcase. I watched her walk up the front path from the kitchen window, my coffee going cold in my hand. My son-in-law was a step behind her, the way he always was, his eyes scanning the property, the way a man surveys something he already considers his. Behind them, my grandson trailed with his hands in his pockets, earbuds in, indifferent to everything except whatever was playing in his head. I remember thinking as I watched them cross my porch that my wife had been in the ground for 96 hours. I counted because I had been counting. Every hour since the moment the hospital called, I set my coffee mug on the counter and went to open the door. My son-in-law smiled at me the way he always smiled, the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He shook my hand with both of his, a practiced gesture of warmth that I had never trusted, even in the early years. My daughter kissed my cheek and told me I looked tired, which was her way of telling me I looked old. My grandson gave a vague wave in my direction without removing his earbuds. They came inside and sat down in my living room, the room Margaret had painted herself, the room where we had spent 31 years of Sunday mornings reading the paper and not needing to say anything at all. I offered them coffee. My son-in-law declined and said they wouldn't be long. He said there were some things they needed to discuss, some pressing matters related to the business, things that couldn't wait. He used the word unfortunate. He said it was unfortunate that these things had to be addressed so soon, but circumstances being what they were, it was simply unavoidable. I sat in my chair and listened. The chair across from me, Margaret's chair, was empty. What he laid out in the next 20 minutes was not a conversation. It was an announcement. He spoke about the restaurant chain as though I had already handed it to him, as though the transition of ownership were a formality to be processed rather than a decision to be made. Harlan's Smokehouse. 4 locations. 32 years of my life embedded in every brick and every recipe. My son-in-law spoke about brand repositioning and investor interest and the need for new leadership going forward. He used the word legacy the way politicians use it, hollowed out of all meaning. He said he had already spoken to an attorney about expediting the transfer of majority shares. He said my daughter was in full agreement. I looked at my daughter when he said that. She was examining the stitching on the arm of the sofa. She had her mother's hands. She couldn't look at me. I nodded slowly and said very little. I told them I needed time to think. I told them this was not something I was willing to decide in a week, let alone 4 days after burying my wife. My son-in-law smiled his smile and said he completely understood, and that of course I should take all the time I needed, but that the longer these things were left unresolved, the more uncertainty it created for the business. He put a hand on my knee, a gesture of comfort that made my skin crawl, and told me that Margaret would have wanted what was best for everyone. I showed them to the door. When I closed it behind them, I stood alone in the foyer for a long time. The house had a particular quality of silence in those days, not peaceful but pressurized, like the silence inside a sealed room. I could smell her everywhere, the faint trace of the lavender she kept in bowls by the windows, the cedar from the linen closet she reorganized every spring. She had been in every corner of this house for 3 decades, and now she was in none of it, and yet somehow she was everywhere. I went back to the kitchen and poured my cold coffee down the drain. The business had been mine long before my daughter met her husband. I started Harlan's when I was 32 years old, with a second-hand smoker, a rented space the size of a 2-car garage, and a sauce recipe my father had written on a piece of butcher paper sometime in the 1960s. Margaret worked beside me from the first day, running the front of house while I worked the pit. We opened at 10 in the morning and sometimes didn't lock up until past midnight. We missed school plays. We missed anniversaries. We made it up to each other in the quiet moments, the ones you don't remember specifically but that accumulate into a life. By the time our daughter was in high school, we had 3 locations. By the time she brought her husband home to meet us, we had 4, and I was being approached by a regional investment group that wanted to franchise. I had always liked the fact that we stayed small enough to stay ours. My son-in-law had come into the picture about 8 years ago. He was polished in a way I found exhausting, the kind of man who always seemed to be performing competence rather than demonstrating it. He worked in commercial real estate, or said he did. He had opinions about everything and expertise in nothing. My wife, who was a better judge of character than anyone I have ever known, said very little about him for the first 2 years. She was polite. She was careful. When our daughter announced the engagement, Margaret smiled and hugged her and said she was happy. That night, when we were alone in the kitchen washing dishes, she said to me, very quietly, that she hoped she was wrong about him. I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and said it was nothing, that she was probably being protective, that she sometimes saw problems where there weren't any. I believed her because I wanted to. I should have asked her again. 3 weeks after the funeral, I found myself doing what widowed men apparently do in the small hours of sleepless nights, wandering the house, opening drawers, and touching objects with no particular purpose, as though contact with familiar things might substitute for the absence of the person who had given them meaning. I ended up in Margaret's small study, the room off the hallway that had always been hers, where she kept her reading chair and her bookcases, and the old roll-top desk she inherited from her mother. I wasn't looking for anything. I sat in her reading chair for a while. I pulled a book from the shelf and set it in my lap without opening it. I looked at the desk and thought about all the evenings I had passed the doorway and seen her there, reading glasses low on her nose, pencil in hand. That particular quality of absorbed concentration on her face that meant she was entirely somewhere else and entirely content to be there. I sat with that image until it became unbearable, and then I stood up to leave. That was when I noticed the Bible on the corner of the desk. Margaret wasn't a church-going woman in any conventional sense, but she kept her grandmother's Bible on that desk her entire adult life. She said it made her feel connected to something longer than herself. It was a large, worn book with a cracked leather cover and pages so thin they were nearly translucent. I had never opened it. It wasn't mine to open. I almost walked out of the room. Instead, I sat back down and picked it up. I told myself I just wanted to hold something that had belonged to her. That was all. But as I lifted it, I noticed it sat unevenly in my hands, heavier on one side than the other. I opened the cover. There was an envelope tucked just inside, flat against the frontispiece, so neatly placed it was nearly invisible. A small white envelope with my name written on the front in Margaret's handwriting. I recognized the particular loops of her capital letters. My throat tightened. She had a beautiful, distinctive hand, the kind you don't forget. I sat very still for a moment. The house settled and creaked around me. Outside, a wind was moving through the oak trees in the backyard, and the sound of it was the only sound in the world. I slid the envelope open. The note inside was short, 2 paragraphs in her familiar handwriting, written on a small folded sheet of her notepaper with the pale blue border she had kept in the desk for 30 years. She had written, "There are things I should have told you while I still could. I wasn't brave enough, and I am sorry. I didn't want to hurt you before I was sure. Now I'm not sure I'll have the chance to be sure. If you're reading this, then I ran out of time, and I need you to go to the bank. The safety deposit box. The second key is under the tray in my jewelry drawer. You need to see what I found. I love you. I have always only ever loved you. Please be careful. I read it twice. Then a third time. The second reading was slower, as though slowing down might change the words. I folded the note and held it in my hands. I could feel my pulse in my palms. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning I drove to the bank before it had fully opened, and I sat in the parking lot waiting until I saw the doors unlock. The woman at the private banking desk knew me. She had processed Margaret's estate paperwork. She gave me a look of practiced sympathy and led me to the back. The safety deposit box was longer than I expected. When I lifted the lid, I found 3 things: a thumb drive in a small plastic sleeve, a sealed manila envelope, and a folded handwritten page that said simply, "Watch this first, then read." I took everything home. I closed the study door. I opened my laptop, inserted the thumb drive, and pressed play. What came out of the speakers was my wife's voice. She had recorded herself. She was at her desk. I could tell by the ambient sounds, the faint traffic from the window, the creak of the chair I knew so well. She spoke for 47 minutes. She spoke in the steady, unhurried voice of a woman who has thought carefully about every word she is about to say. She told me that 8 months ago, she had started noticing things. Small things at first. A discrepancy in a vendor invoice. a line item in the quarterly books that didn't correspond to any supplier she could identify. She was not a trained accountant, but she had helped run a business for 30 years, and she knew how our numbers were supposed to look. She said she had mentioned it to my son-in-law, who was by then handling our bookkeeping on a freelance basis, something our daughter had arranged 2 years prior when our longtime accountant retired. He had dismissed her concerns pleasantly and told her she was misreading the formatting. She said she had nodded and thanked him and gone home and called a private investigator. She said she didn't tell me because she didn't want to damage my relationship with my daughter while she was still gathering information. She said she didn't want to be wrong. She said she knew how much I wanted to believe our family was what it appeared to be. Her voice was calm the entire time. The steadiness of it was harder to listen to than tears would have been. She told me what the investigator had found. The manila envelope contained his report. I read it at the desk where she used to sit. It took me a long time to finish because I had to stop several times and look out the window at the oak trees until I could continue. What it contained was methodical and devastating. My son-in-law had been billing the business through 2 shell vendor accounts he had created after taking over our books. The total over 22 months was difficult to comprehend as a single number, so I broke it down the way the investigator had, line by line, month by month. He had taken close to $240,000 from Harlan's Smokehouse. From the business I had built from a second-hand smoker and a piece of butcher paper with my father's sauce recipe on it, there was more. The investigator had run a background check, the thorough kind. My son-in-law's name was not the name he was born with. He had legally changed it 14 years ago, 2 years before he met my daughter. 1 year after he had been released from a federal minimum security facility, following a conviction for wire fraud in connection with a real estate scheme. He had served 18 months. He had changed his name, rebuilt his presentation, and started again, and evidently found that marrying into a family business was a more reliable long-term strategy than anything else he had tried. My daughter's name was not in the report. The investigator had found no evidence she was aware of the financial fraud or his prior history. Margaret had added a note in the margins of that page, in pencil, a single underlined sentence in her handwriting. "I don't think she knows. Protect her from this if you can." I sat with that note for a long time. I put the report back in the envelope and closed the box and went to the kitchen and made myself lunch, which I didn't eat. Then I picked up the phone and called the one person I needed to call. My lawyer had been my lawyer for 24 years. We had worked together through every stage of the business. The original incorporation, the first lease disputes, the liability issues that come with running a food service operation, the partnership framework, when I briefly considered bringing in outside investors before deciding against it. He was not a warm man, in the conventional sense, but he was precise and loyal, and had never once told me what I wanted to hear, when what I needed to hear was something else. When I called and told him I needed to see him that afternoon, he said, "I'll clear 2 o'clock. His office was downtown, on the 4th floor of a building with good bones and modest pretensions. I had been there hundreds of times. The receptionist knew me by name. My lawyer came out to meet me himself rather than having her show me in. He shook my hand and looked at my face and didn't say anything about condolences. He had offered them at the funeral. He understood that a second round would serve neither of us. We sat across from each other at his conference table. I put the manila envelope between us. I told him I needed him to read it before I said anything, so that he would understand the full shape of what I was about to tell him. He read every page of the investigator's report with the same expression a surgeon might have reading a patient's chart, attentive and still. When he finished, he placed the last page on the table, squared the stack, and looked at me. He said, "How long have you known?" I told him I had found it the previous night. I told him about the Bible, the envelope, the thumb drive, Margaret's voice in the quiet study. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She protected you very carefully." I didn't trust my voice right then, so I nodded. He asked me what I wanted to do. It was the right question, delivered without sentiment, without editorializing. He was giving me the wheel. I thought about Vanessa at the funeral. I thought about the briefcase on my porch. I thought about my son-in-law's hand on my knee and the words Margaret would have wanted what was best for everyone. I thought about $240,000, about a federal conviction, about a man who had calculated that my family was an asset to be managed. I told my lawyer that I wanted to give my son-in-law exactly what he had been asking for. I told him I wanted to schedule the formal meeting he had been demanding, the ownership discussion, the transfer conversation, the whole performance. I wanted him to walk into that room with every one of his documents and every ounce of his confidence. I wanted him to sit down at my table and lay out his entire hand. And then, I said, we were going to show him ours. My lawyer made a sound that was not quite a smile and reached for his legal pad. We spent 3 hours in that conference room. He had reviewed the corporate structure of Harlan's many times over the years, but now he went through it differently, the way you read something again when the stakes have changed. He pointed out a clause in the original operating agreement, drafted decades ago when I first incorporated, which stipulated that any transfer of controlling interest required the written consent of both the founding members and a verification of the transferee's fitness to manage, including a background disclosure. The language was dusty, and we had never invoked it, but it was there, in black and white, exactly where we had put it. He said Margaret had insisted on that clause. He said he had advised her it was somewhat unusual for a small family business, and she had said she wanted it anyway. He looked at me when he said it, with an expression I recognized from all our years of working together, the expression that meant the pieces had just aligned. He said, my son-in-law could not receive a transfer of any operational control without passing a background disclosure. He said a prior federal fraud conviction, undisclosed to the founding members, would disqualify him under the existing agreement. He said the financial irregularities constituted grounds for civil recovery and potential criminal referral, which we would hold in reserve as leverage. He said the whole structure of their proposal collapsed the moment we introduced a single piece of documentation. He also said, gently, that my daughter's position would need to be considered separately, that there might be conversations ahead that were harder than the boardroom one, and that I should be prepared for that. I told him I knew. I told him I had been thinking about nothing else. We agreed that I would call my son-in-law the following day and tell him I was ready to proceed with the ownership discussion. We would schedule it for the following Friday, at the restaurant's main location, the original Harlan's on Route 9, where it had all started. My turf, my table, my terms. My son-in-law would have no reason to suspect anything. He had seen a grieving man in his late 60s who nodded when told what to do. He had not seen anything else, because I had not shown him anything else. That, my lawyer said, is your advantage. I drove home in the early evening and sat on the back porch until the light was gone. The yard was dark and the oaks were still, and I sat there in the quiet and talked to Margaret the way I had started doing in those weeks since she passed. Not out loud exactly, but not entirely in my head either. I told her I had found it. I told her I had read every word, heard every word, and that I wished with everything I had that she had come to me while she still could, because we had faced every hard thing together for 30 years, and this should not have been different. I also told her I understood why she hadn't. I told her she had been protecting our daughter, and protecting me, and that even at the end she had been thinking of everyone but herself. I sat out there until the cold drove me inside. The days between that conversation and the meeting were a strange kind of suspension. On the surface, my routine was the quiet routine of a man moving through early grief. I woke up, made coffee, answered correspondence, drove to the restaurants, and walked the floor and talked to my staff. Some of my people had been with me for 15-20 years. They asked how I was holding up with the decency of people who mean it when they ask. I told them I was managing. I was in the middle of something I could not explain to them yet, but I would. Beneath that surface, my lawyer was working. He worked the way he had always worked, methodically and without drama, each document placed precisely where it needed to be. He retained a forensic accounting firm to formalize the analysis of the shell vendor fraud, creating a certified report that could stand up in any proceeding. He verified the background investigation through independent channels, ensuring the record of the prior conviction was airtight and properly sourced. He prepared a structured presentation for the meeting, ordered with the same care a surgeon orders a tray. He told me during one of our calls that my son-in-law's office had contacted him twice to confirm the agenda. He said the tone was confident, bordering on impatient. He said they were already acting like the meeting was a formality. Good, I told him. Let them. Friday came the way hard days always come, with a particular quality of ordinary morning light that doesn't know what it's preceding. I was at the restaurant before anyone else arrived. I walked through the kitchen, which smelled of hickory, and the beginning of the day's prep, and I stood at the counter where I had stood 32 years ago with my father's recipe and no certainty about anything except that this was what I was going to do with my life. The original smoker was still in the back courtyard. I had kept it there as a marker of where it all started. I went into the private dining room we used for events and meetings and pulled out the chairs and set the table. I didn't ask anyone to do it for me. I poured water, set out notepads. I opened the windows because Margaret always said natural light made every difficult conversation easier, and I had no reason to stop believing her. They arrived together, all three of them, 40 minutes later. My son-in-law walked in first. He was wearing a suit, the kind of deliberate formality that signals you consider yourself to be in charge of whatever room you enter. He was carrying the same briefcase as before. My daughter came in behind him, her face drawn in a complicated expression I had been seeing on her since childhood, the expression she wore when she was doing something she was not entirely comfortable with, but had decided to do anyway. My grandson came last, phone in hand, and slumped into a chair at the far end without a word. I greeted them. I was pleasant. I offered coffee and meant it. My son-in-law accepted. My daughter said yes and held the mug in both hands without drinking from it. We sat down. My son-in-law settled into his chair with the ease of a man who has already calculated the outcome and considers the meeting a procedural step toward it. He opened his briefcase and began removing documents, organized in tabbed sections, professionally printed. He placed them on the table with the assurance of a man unveiling a fait accompli. He said he was glad I was ready to move forward. He said he knew this wasn't easy, and he appreciated my willingness to do what was right for the family and for the legacy I had built. He said Margaret's passing had made it clear how important it was to have things settled, to have clear leadership in place so the business could continue to grow. He said he had prepared a full transition plan and that he was confident once I reviewed it, I would see it was the right path forward. He slid the first section across the table. I didn't touch it. He continued. He talked for the better part of 20 minutes, steady and fluent, the polished presentation of a man who had rehearsed it. 80% of operational shares transferred to his management holding company. A buyout structure that valued the business at a number I will not repeat because it was insultingly below market value. A nominal consulting role for me, largely ceremonial. And the original restaurant location, Route 9, where I was currently sitting, to be converted into the first of a franchised expansion under his leadership. He closed his section of the presentation and folded his hands on the table and looked at me with the patient expression of a man waiting for a formality to conclude. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I reached down beside my chair for my own folder. Thin, simple, nothing theatrical about it. I opened it quietly and did not slide anything across the table yet. I said that I appreciated the thorough work he had put into the presentation. I said that before we moved forward, there were a few items I needed us to go through together, and that I had asked my lawyer to join us to make sure everything was handled properly. The knock at the door came then. My lawyer walked in without ceremony, nodded to me, and took the chair to my right. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it with a sound that was not loud, but which filled the room the way certain sounds do when everything else has gone quiet. My son-in-law's expression shifted. Not a collapse, not yet, but a tightening around the eyes. A recalculation happening behind the surface. He looked at my lawyer the way a poker player looks at an unexpected card, not panicked, but reassessing. My daughter's hands tightened around her coffee mug. My lawyer said good morning to everyone and took out a single file. He was composed and unhurried, the way he always was, and the very ordinariness of his manner seemed to increase the unease in the room, rather than dissipate it. He said that before any discussion of ownership transfer could proceed, there were foundational documents governing the business that needed to be reviewed, as they established the legal framework within which any transfer had to occur. He produced a copy of the original operating agreement. He turned to the relevant clause and read it clearly and completely, including the background disclosure requirement for any proposed transferee. My son-in-law said that was a standard clause and posed no issue. My lawyer said he was glad to hear that, because a disclosure had been run. He said it as a simple statement of fact, without inflection or drama, the way you might note that you had confirmed a reservation. The shift in my son-in-law's expression was small but unmistakable. The confidence didn't leave his face exactly. It paused. My lawyer produced the second document. He described it as a certified forensic accounting analysis of the business's financial records for the preceding 22 months, conducted by a licensed firm, and said he would be entering it as part of the formal record. He placed it on the table. He did not push it toward my son-in-law. He simply placed it there, in the center, where everyone could see the cover page. My son-in-law said he didn't understand what this had to do with the transfer discussion. My lawyer looked at him and said, quite evenly, that it had everything to do with it. He said the analysis identified disbursements totaling $239,400 made over the preceding 22 months through 2 vendor accounts, neither of which corresponded to any legitimate supplier in the company's records. He said the disbursements had been authorized by the person managing the company's books during that period. He looked directly at my son-in-law when he said this, and he did not look away. The room was very still. My son-in-law began to say something. He stopped. He started again. He said the accounting was complex and that there were legitimate operational explanations that he would need time to document. His voice had lost the fluency it had carried for the first 20 minutes. He sounded, for the first time in 8 years of knowing him, uncertain. My lawyer said he understood, and that those explanations could certainly be provided, and that in the meantime he had one additional item to put on the table before they proceeded to any of those explanations. He produced the third document and placed it beside the first 2. He said that the background disclosure, conducted per the requirements of the operating agreement, had surfaced a prior federal conviction for wire fraud, under a name the individual had subsequently changed, resulting in an 18-month sentence served 14 years ago. He stated the original name clearly. He stated the case number. He stated the date of conviction and the date of release. My daughter's coffee mug made a small sound when she set it down on the table. My son-in-law did not speak. All the architecture of his composure, everything he had built and practiced and carried into this room, seemed to lose its structural integrity in the space of about 3 seconds. The polished surface cracked, and beneath it was not rage, as I might have expected, but something quieter, and in some ways worse. It was the look of a man who has been running from something for a very long time and has just looked over his shoulder and found it directly behind him. He sat back in his chair. He looked at me. I looked back. I did not speak for a long time. When I did, my voice was steady. I told him that my wife had found the discrepancies herself. I told him she had done what she always did, which was to be careful and thorough before she said anything to anyone. I told him she had been protecting our daughter. I told him she had been protecting me. He said nothing. I told him that he had come into my house 4 days after I buried her, and sat in the chair across from where she used to sit, and told me that Margaret would have wanted what was best for everyone. I told him that was the moment I understood exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. And I told him that my wife, who was smarter than both of us, and had known it long before I did, had made sure he would not succeed. He opened his mouth and closed it again. My daughter spoke then for the first time since we had sat down. She said his name. It was a single word, and it carried 32 years of someone asking a question and already knowing they won't like the answer. What followed was not a confrontation in any dramatic sense. There was no shouting. My lawyer had structured things so that there was nothing for my son-in-law to argue against and nothing for him to negotiate from. He had walked into the room with all his cards and found that none of them were playable. The case for a civil recovery action was fully assembled. The option of a criminal referral to the relevant authorities was noted, but not yet exercised, which was the most effective thing my lawyer could have done with it. The background disclosure made him ineligible for any ownership role under the terms of the operating agreement. Every door had been closed before he arrived, and he hadn't known to bring a key. He took his documents off my table. He put them back in his briefcase with none of the confidence he had used to remove them. He did not look at me again. He stood, and he left the room, and the sound of the door closing behind him was the quietest sound in the world. My grandson had been still for the better part of an hour. He was looking at the table. He looked like a boy who had just discovered that the map he had been given of the world was drawn incorrectly, and he didn't yet know how much of it to trust. I stayed at the table for a while after my lawyer and my grandson had stepped out to give us privacy. My daughter and I sat across from each other in the room where I had served my first rack of ribs 32 years ago, and neither of us spoke for a long time. She told me she hadn't known about the money. She said it in a voice that was very small, and I believed her the way I had believed her since she was a child. Not because she was incapable of falsehood, but because I knew the specific quality of her voice when she was telling the truth. She said she had known something was wrong. She said she had told herself she was imagining it. She said her mother had tried to tell her, once, carefully, and she had not listened. I said that her mother had known she wouldn't listen. I said that was why her mother had left it to me. My daughter put her face in her hands and cried in the way adults cry when they are grieving more than one thing at once. I got up and moved around the table and put my hand on her shoulder. She was my daughter. She had her mother's hands. None of what had been done to our family was her doing, and she was going to spend a long time reckoning with the parts of it that were, and that was between her and her own conscience. And she would need her father during it. I told her she could stay for lunch. I told her the kitchen was about to start the midday prep, and that the brisket on Fridays was still the best thing we made. Same as it had always been. Same as it had been since I learned the recipe from a man in East Texas when I was 25 years old. I told her I was not going anywhere, and that Harlan's was not going anywhere, and that whatever needed to be figured out, we would figure it out. She looked up at me with her mother's eyes, red and uncertain, and I looked back at her and tried to put everything I felt into my expression so she would know it without my having to say all of it. Because some things you carry 32 years with a person, and you can't translate them into sentences. She stayed for lunch. My lawyer filed the civil recovery action 10 days later. My son-in-law did not contest it. The terms of the settlement, finalized privately, included full restitution and a legal agreement precluding him from any involvement in the business or any claim on its assets. The criminal referral was ultimately not pursued, which was my decision to make, and which I made for reasons that had nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with my daughter and my grandson. I promoted 2 of my longest-serving managers to an operations partnership and brought in a legitimate financial firm to handle the books going forward. I walked every location, shook every hand, made sure everyone who had been there since the beginning knew they still had a place. A man I had hired 20 years ago, who had started as a line cook and now ran our busiest kitchen, told me he was glad nothing had changed. I told him everything had changed and none of it was what mattered. What I think about, in the evenings on the back porch, is the 47 minutes of my wife's voice on that recording. I have listened to it 3 times. Each time I catch something I missed before, a quality of careful love in how she chose every word, an absolute determination to make sure I would be all right after she was gone. She had been sick for 8 months when she made it. She had known she was running out of time, and she had used the time she had left not to protect herself, but to make sure what we had built could not be taken from me. I am 64 years old. I have run a business for 32 years. I have loved one woman for 31 of them, and spent the last 3 months learning how to carry her with me, rather than looking for her in rooms she no longer occupies. I could not have stood in that room on Friday morning and done what I did if she had not been standing there beside me. I keep the note from the Bible in my coat pocket. The paper is worn at the folds now from being unfolded and refolded. I don't read it every day. Some days, I just reach into my pocket and feel its presence there, which is enough. I love you. I have always only ever loved you. Please be careful. I was careful, Maggie. I was careful because you made sure I knew how to be. If you're watching this and you've been through something like it, I'd be glad to hear from you in the comments below. And if you believe, as I do, that the truth has a way of surviving everything you try to bury it under, please subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from.